Thank you everyone for tuning in, whether you're watching me live through Zoom or Facebook, or whether you're tuning into the recorded version, which you might be watching on YouTube. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with me. The subject I'm covering this evening is the lifetimes and most decisive acts of Charles FitzClarence, an Anglo-Irish soldier, a Victoria Cross holder, and a man who was described soon after the First World War has ended, quite simply, as the man who saved the empire for his quick thinking and decisive action at the First Battle of Ypres. But he's a figure who, although very famous in the 1920s, his fame, his name has largely been forgotten to the annals of history, and only those who are true students, perhaps, of the First World War will know anything much of Charles FitzClarence, of his life, of his times, and of how he came to be in that position where his decision-making would ultimately save, perhaps not the British Empire as a whole, but certainly would save the British Expeditionary Force during the maelstrom of the First Battle of Ypres. Over this coming talk, I'm going to cover his early life, how he won the Victoria Cross, his peacetime career, and it, of course, will culminate with his decisive role at the First Battle of Ypres. I hope you'll find it extremely interesting. If there's any questions at the end that I don't get to, you can contact me through Twitter. My Twitter handle is @historian1914, or feel free to look me up on the University of Wolverhampton website, and you can always drop me an email. This all said, let us turn to the life and times of this man, Charles FitzClarence. A man with royal blood in his veins. He was actually the great-grandson of William IV, unfortunately through an illegitimate branch of the family, so that he had no claim on the throne. He was born on the 8th of May, 1865. He was actually one of twins, his twin brother Edward being born the first of the two twins. He came from a military family, part of that almost definitive Anglo-Irish family bloodlines that provided so many officers and indeed soldiers for the British Army in the 1800s. And Charles was always destined to go on to be a soldier. There was simply no other option for him. He studied at Eton and then later at Wellington College, and he joined the British Army through the classic backdoor route, joining the militia first and then transferring from the militia into his chosen unit, which was the Royal Fusiliers. He joined at a relatively, comparatively late age. He was actually 21 when he joined in the 1880s, in 1886. Moved into the Royal Fusiliers as a lean, handsome, but comparatively lightweight 6'2" soldier. And this photograph of him at a relatively young age, this is actually him in the 1890s, gives you some idea of his appearance at this time. But when he first joined the army in the 1880s, he was still filling out his frame. And even though he was tall, as his twin brother Edward was also tall, he was actually a little bit physically frail in the early part of his army career. He was particularly prone to chest infections, bronchial problems, which stopped him taking as an active a role in the Fusiliers as he would have liked. And in fact, for the early part of his career, he was largely confined to desk work and administrative roles as a young lieutenant. And this was a great source of frustration to Charles FitzClarence, who was eager to get on with his military career, but found himself constantly denied the opportunities to actually see active service because of his relatively frail, or so it was felt at the time, constitution. And he moved through a series of unfancied administrative posts in the 1880s and early 1890s, things like battalion postmaster, which he served in several times. He actually took his examination, which would allow him to progress to captain in 1890, but he wouldn't have an opportunity to move to that rank for 9 years. But as his constitution improved, as he grew into his frame, as he became a bit fitter and a bit stronger, a bit more accustomed to this type of life, he started seeking ways to advance his career. He took an early interest in machine guns, not necessarily a well-fancied weapon in the British Army of the 1890s, taking a course in their use in the early part of the 1890s. But his breakthrough in terms of his career actually came in 1895. When he volunteered for a mounted infantryman's course as an officer. The mounted infantryman's course was a 10-week course that infantrymen and officers would undertake, which would teach them the rudiments of horse care, horse riding, and mounted work. But they would remain part of their permanent infantry battalions, and they'd actually return and become foot sluggers once more at the end of the course. But if they were then sent abroad, they would be able to serve as mounted infantry and provide mobile eyes and ears for the battalion. And this was quite important for an army that was often engaged in small-scale deployments in far-flung parts of the empire, where cavalry was not readily available, but scouting was most definitely required. Mounted infantrymen could provide that service. And it was during this training course that Charles FitzClarence first caught the eyes of his superiors, who noted his energy, his ability, and his initiative, skills which of course were of prime importance for a mounted infantry officer who'd often be operating at the very fringes of his unit in dangerous conditions. That was in 1895, and it was from this point that Charles FitzClarence's career began to blossom more. He was bitterly disappointed to miss out on opportunities for active service in the 1880s, and was somewhat envious of his twin brother Edward, who did get to serve in the Sudan in this period. But that envy turned to sorrow in 1897 when the news arrived that Edward had been killed fighting Mahdists in the Sudan at the Battle of Abu Hamed. FitzClarence himself wouldn't have opportunity for service abroad until 1899, when the Royal Fusiliers went to Egypt and he was able to become part of the Mounted Infantry Detachment. But his real chance for action was to come a little bit later in that year. And the catalyst for this was the looming war in southern Africa. Relations between Transvaal and the Orange Free State and the British Empire was sinking throughout this period. War had become increasingly inevitable from the late 1890s onwards, and indeed war is expected to break out at any moment in the year 1899. To help prepare the British Empire's defences in and around South Africa, a call went out for volunteers for British Army officers to serve as special service officers. Special service officers, those detached from their parent battalions or cavalry regiments and sent to perform very special duties as required by the needs of the British Empire. FitzClarence saw this as an opportunity to gain entrance to Staff College, which is something he aspired to do, and so he volunteered to head out to Southern Africa and become one of the special service officers tasked with raising essentially improvised imperial troops who could provide emergency garrisons or other forms of support for the regular British Army that be operating in this area. He ended up being sent to the dusty border town here, Mafeking, of course, a town that would become famous later in the conflict and the site of one of the most famous sieges in British military history. And so the young Lieutenant FitzClarence, acting captain, went to Mafeking, where he met, of course, this man, then Lieutenant Colonel Robert Baden-Powell, later, of course, to be the founder of the Boy Scouts, and he would be the garrison commander at Mafeking. FitzClarence and Baden-Powell immediately struck up a good relationship with one another. They were both energetic, they were both innovative, they were both very determined individuals. Baden-Powell much more of an eccentric than FitzClarence. FitzClarence was not lacked the eccentricities of his chief, but they both recognized in one another the vital energy and determination that drew them to one another. They certainly possessed similar styles of command and had similar approaches to preparing Mafeking for a siege, or for war, I should say. Of course, siege was not initially anticipated. And it was here that FitzClarence would receive his first command as a squadron commander in the Bechuanaland Protectorate Regiment. And this is a photograph actually of the officers of the Protectorate Regiment here. You've got FitzClarence seated here, right next to Baden-Powell seated next to him, and then a various collection of other officers who were involved in this unit. What's interesting about the Protectorate Regiment is its composition. This was by no means an enviable command. FitzClarence was placed in charge of Squadron B of the Protectorate Regiment. The Protectorate Regiment drew its soldiers from the surrounding area of Mafeking and the edges of the British Empire, and so it was comprised of a strange mixture of people. There were some settlers and settlers' sons involved in the unit, but mainly the unit was composed of pretty rough and ready characters, frontier freebooters who attached themselves to various misadventures, failed gold miners who'd come from the Rand, other outsiders, drifters, tough essentially frontier tough men who were looking for some form of employment and seized upon the Protectorate Regiment as a way to get regular pay and some rations at the same time. This meant that these men possessed certain characteristics: tough, resourceful, they knew something of the local area. A handful had prior military experience in either the British Army or a European army, and they were certainly self-sufficient, many of them experienced in handling weapons and riding horses too. But they also came with the rowdy attitude that was inherent to this borderland region. They were tough, they were hard drinking, and they were rather scornful of authority. And this was a stern task, therefore, for FitzClarence to knock these frontier toughs into some kind of shape and turn them into an organised unit. He only arrived in July 1899. The war would break out in October 1899, so there was precious little time to assemble this unit and undertake anything except the most basic training. And by FitzClarence's own admission, his squadron was at best partially trained when the war broke out on the 11th of October, 1899. But there was no time to do more than the basics, because FitzClarence will be thrown into action almost immediately. The war broke out on the 11th of October. 3 days later, FitzClarence would be in action for the first time. And the occasion was a battle or a skirmish to protect a vehicle rather like this one. This is a British armoured train operating in the region of Mafeking. Mafeking possessed an armoured train, not an especially formidable military machine, it must be said, useful for intimidating bands of outlaws or driving off African war parties, but not really appropriate for a war against the Boers, who are, of course, equipped with modern rifles and artillery. The Mafeking armoured train had actually gone out on the 14th of October. I realise I've got the date wrong here. That should, of course, be the 14th, not the 11th. The war breaks out on the 11th. The train had actually sallied out at the start of the morning on the 14th of October, looking to drive off a Boer patrol, which had been sighted from the hills approaching Mafeking. But it turned out that this Boer patrol was actually just a vanguard of a much, much larger and more powerful force that was soon sweeping down upon the armoured train, threatening to encircle it, derail it, and indeed capture it. Firing broke out, the train reversed course, was trying to puff back along the tracks, being pursued by mounted Boers who were seeking to get ahead of it, block it, and derail it. It was in these circumstances that FitzClarence, riding at the head of B Squadron of the Protectorate Regiment, rode out with somewhere in the region of 50 to 80 men, the records aren't entirely clear, of the squadron, rode out to try and protect the armoured train. He took a position on some high ground overlooking the tracks, where initially he dispersed a group of Boer fighters who were trying to block the train tracks, and then he provided covering fire as the train slowly puffed its way past, being hit by bullets, of course, from the Boers who were closing in on it. Once the train was clear, FitzClarence held his position on the high ground just a little bit longer, so the train had plenty of time to get back into the shelter of the town. But this meant that the position on the hill became the main focus for the Boer attack. They started to lap around FitzClarence's flanks and engaged his troopers furiously from the front, bullets striking the rocks and the gnarled trees in which his riflemen were taking shelter. FitzClarence had faced a difficult decision. If he withdrew too quickly, then there was a chance the Boers would sweep down on the armoured train. If he held his position too long, he'd be encircled and his squadron would be captured. But he timed his manoeuvre to perfection, holding off just long enough for the train to get to safety before giving the order for his squadron to fall back in bounds, the fire of one portion covering the retreat of the next, and then mount up their horses at the bottom of the hill and gallop away at speed back to the safety of Mafeking. It was a small but important action in which FitzClarence was described as having manoeuvred brilliantly, bringing his forces into action, saving the armoured train, and then retreating back with relatively light casualties. FitzClarence himself was thrilled by his experience of battle, writing enthusiastically to his wife about how happy he was to have finally seen action and been in charge of it as well. It was an auspicious start for the young captain, and further adventures were to follow. Because just a few hours, in fact, after the armoured train had retreated back into Mafeking, Mafeking itself began to be encircled by the oncoming Boer forces, who would set out to seize the town of Mafeking to prevent it being used as a launch pad for an invasion from the west. The siege of Mafeking would, of course, become a British military legend, lasting well over 6 months and becoming celebrated in the press of the day. Trench lines were formed around Mafeking. The Boers emplaced artillery, such as the gun you can see here, carried out shelling of the town, but ultimately were aiming to try and starve the town out. But the trench lines around Mafeking did not preclude opportunities for action. The Boers fortified their trenches. You've got an impression of it here. You can see the sandbagged gun position here with the shells nearby, a firing platform included. They dug trenches of their own. They even constructed some corrugated iron and timber forts in certain places along the trench lines. And the situation was not unlike a miniature First World War in many ways, but it did not preclude the opportunity for action. And just such an action would take place on the 26th of October with FitzClarence once more at the head of B Squadron of the Protectorate Regiment. And this is a Captain Woodville painting or picture. This is FitzClarence himself moving forward into action. The plan was to carry out a trench raid upon the Boers under cover of darkness, surprise them, and in the words of FitzClarence, scuttle the defenders, so put them to the sword and put them to the bayonet before withdrawing with minimal losses to his own fighting unit. FitzClarence led this raid from the front. Even though the distance between the British lines and the Boer lines was relatively small, the slow movement of the Protectorate Regiment to maintain surprise meant it took 45 agonizing minutes for the regiment, or the squadron, I should say, to creep across no man's land in total darkness before they were in a position to spring into the Boer trenches. And dropped equipment rattled with awful sounds. Men tried to stifle coughs. The tension as they crossed this no man's land, they crept across, must have been absolutely terrific. But presently, after 45 minutes of this agonizing movement, FitzClarence adjudged they were in position to strike. He gave, in the words of one witness, a whoop and a hurrah, leapt to his feet and jumped into the trenches, closely followed by the Protectorate Regiment soldiers. The first man that FitzClarence encountered was a startled Boer sentry who hadn't heard the approach of the attackers. And this Boer sentry raised his rifle to fire, but apparently FitzClarence beheaded this man with a single sword stroke, which are well attested to by witnesses in this raid. Slew the sentry, and then all hell broke loose, of course, in the trench as men piled in and attacked the Boer garrison. In the fighting that followed, FitzClarence personally dispatched 3 more Boer fighters with his sword before the trench was adjudged to have been captured, and FitzClarence gave a blast on his whistle to indicate the regiment could fall back. FitzClarence then witnessed or encouraged or directed the retreat, the falling back of his regiment while standing atop the Boer parapet. By this stage, the Boers were recovering their senses and started to pour fire into FitzClarence's position. And a bullet actually struck FitzClarence in the chest. It may have been a spent bullet, or according to some accounts, it may have struck a compass case, which he had in his breast pocket. But regardless, it gave him a painful but non-fatal wound. He was then able to fall back alongside the rest of his regiment, having inflicted significant damage, significant casualties on the Boers, who were caught completely by surprise. The intensity of the raid horrified the Boers. They described it as simple butchery. They did not appreciate this type of attack, and they raged against the British throughout the night, firing shells, firing rifle fusillades into no man's land, and generally acting in a highly aggressive posture. But FitzClarence and the Protectorate Regiment fell back with very few casualties, having inflicted quite a significant number themselves. It was in this action, it seems, that FitzClarence picked up the unusual nickname that would follow him for the remainder of his career, the Demon. Apparently a name bestowed upon him by the Protectorate Regiment and then picked up by Baden-Powell himself, who popularized it during the siege of Mafeking. And this was quite an unusual nickname in the comparatively straight-laced Victorian army. And it suggests something about FitzClarence, that perhaps there was a love of battle or a fire of battle that raged in FitzClarence that was actually out of the ordinary. And his ferocity in the trench raid here, slaying at least 4 Boers with his sword and possibly decapitating one in the process, gives you some idea about how this nickname developed. The name also owed something to the Protectorate Regiment itself, which, as I say, was not a standard British Army unit, but instead was drawn from local frontier toughs who were perhaps less constrained by convention. But the startling success of the raid and FitzClarence's part in it went further to establish his reputation as a bold, aggressive, dynamic, and indeed ruthless commander. But then followed a lull in the siege of Mafeking. Months crept by with relatively little advancement on either side. And this lull did not suit Baden-Powell, of course, dynamic and innovative and aggressive in many ways. And he started to chafe at this and started to worry it was having an ill effect, of course, on British morale in the garrison. And part of this stemmed from the fact that news had reached the garrison about British defeats at Black Week, of course, that disastrous period of defeats between the 10th of December and the 15th of December, where 3 British field armies had been defeated on their way to relieve the besieged towns of Kimberley and Ladysmith. The Boers had celebrated this news, but of course it had left the British dispirited, despondent, and indeed grappling with the idea that perhaps the war was going to be lost. And to this end, Baden-Powell planned another raid, what he in fact termed a kick against the Boer defences, the kick being aimed at a particular target, Game Tree Fort, which screened the approaches to a Boer artillery emplacement, which Baden-Powell hoped could be seized, the gun disabled, and a morale-boosting victory given to the British as a result. There was actually a Christmas truce at Mafeking on Christmas Day. The Boers, of course, a very religious society, celebrated it vigorously. And Baden-Powell calculated that this might give the British an opportunity to strike the Boers while they were still rather hungover, on at least not in a high state of readiness, on Boxing Day, the 26th of December. But the Boers were well aware of what Baden-Powell was planning. British preparations for the assault on Game Tree Fort had been signalled by the activities in front of the fort itself. The fort itself, incidentally, was a timber and corrugated iron and partially sandbagged emplacement. Not supremely formidable, but certainly formidable to a force such as that at Mafeking that lacked much artillery and couldn't really shoot it to pieces. The Boers had observed unusual activity opposite Game Tree Fort and anticipated a raid was about to strike it. And far from reducing their garrison, far from, in fact, reaching a lower state of readiness, in actual fact, they had reached a higher state of readiness. They were preparing an ambush of their own for Baden-Powell's assault. The assault went in on the 26th of December. It was a fiasco. A preparatory artillery bombardment, such as it was, failed to make any kind of dent in the Boer defences. The initial assault that rushed at Game Tree Fort met a hail of fire from the reinforced Boer position, which gunned down all of the attacking waves, officers and NCOs. FitzClarence and the Protectorate Regiment were actually in reserve at Game Tree Fort, but went forward to try and renew the stalled attack without success. Exactly what happened to FitzClarence at this attack is somewhat unclear. Various witnesses put him in different places at the battle, but what is certain is that he was shot through both legs and had to be carried away from the action, badly injured. And indeed, he was lucky that these wounds did not prove fatal. One of my favourite stories relating to FitzClarence at this action, though, is that he, according to one witness, actually climbed on top of Game Tree Fort and was firing through a trapdoor that was atop the fort before bullets came out from inside and actually went through his legs. Another witness said that FitzClarence actually got inside Game Tree Fort and was fighting with sword and revolver before he was wounded. It's more likely, though, that FitzClarence was gunned down on the approach to Game Tree Fort and was taken away from the battlefield from that position. The wounds he'd suffered would keep him out of significant action for the remainder of the siege at Mafeking. He would be recovering from these for the rest of 1899 and, of course, into 1900, though he was fit enough to participate in a garrison cricket match in April 1900. But his role in these 3 actions, the defence of the armoured train, the trench raid on the 26th of October, and then the raid at Game Tree Fort, had caught the notice of Baden-Powell and the British Army as a whole. The courage and determination, the aggression that had been shown by FitzClarence resulted in his nomination for the award of the Victoria Cross, which was bestowed upon him once the siege of Mafeking was lifted in mid-1900. FitzClarence would continue to serve in South Africa, first as a staff officer with the Rhodesia Regiment, and then later as a staff officer with a sort of roving commission in this period. But in 1901, he would return back to the United Kingdom to join the recently founded Irish Guards, a unit which he would remain associated with for the remainder of his life. And having established his career and his reputation in South Africa, FitzClarence was in a strong position to develop his career professionally in the years that followed. He went to Staff College in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Boer War and achieved the coveted letters PSC, Passed Staff College. And indeed, in the early part of the 1900s, he was actually primarily involved in staff roles. He was clearly an educated soldier, and he certainly seemed to have an interest in this in the early part of his career. And yet, as one confidential report on him noted, that he was not ideally suited to working from behind a desk, an attitude that I'm sure some of us can appreciate and approve of. He was better in the field. He had an eye for terrain, and he had, as another report noted, the unique ability of being able to teach others. He was an excellent instructor, as well as having an eye for tactics and maneuver as demonstrated in action in the Boer War. And perhaps his experience training those disparate frontier toughs in South Africa had given him an eye for training the men of the Irish Guards. FitzClarence's ambition was that the Irish Guards should become the finest of all the Guards units in the British Army. And of course, they had a lot to live up to. They were, at this stage, the youngest of the Guards regiments, and were somewhat looked down upon by the Grenadiers, Coldstreamers, and Scots Guards. FitzClarence was determined to redress this balance and by sheer dint of effort make the Irish Guards the finest fighting unit in the British Army. And in this period, he went a long way to achieving this. He steadily progressed through the ranks of the Irish Guards, moving from company commander to battalion commander until by 1913, he was commander of the entire regiment as a lieutenant colonel. And during his time as a battalion CO, the Irish Guards improved in the estimation of General Horace Smith-Dorrien, a man who knew a thing or two about training, improved by at least 50% under the intense guidance of FitzClarence, who, according to contemporaries, was loved and feared by his battalion in equal measure. And in fact, the endurance of the nickname the Demon owed something to his intense attitude towards training and his ferocity in correcting those who got things wrong. But at the same time, by creating such high standards, by driving the battalion forward, he created a strong bond with the regiment that would last until his untimely death. At the outbreak of war, FitzClarence was extremely disappointed not to have the opportunity to actually lead the battalion to France into action. Instead, he was actually promoted and he became commander of 29th Brigade, part of 10th Irish Division, training as part of the new army. He, for a chance circumstance, may well have ended up fighting at Gallipoli had circumstances not taken another twist. But what he craved more than anything was to fight alongside his own regiment. He'd be denied that chance for some time, but another opportunity arose soon after the outbreak of war. The origin of this opportunity owed something to the fate of one of FitzClarence's former commanders, and that was Brigadier-General Ivan Maxey, who was commanding First Guards Brigade. Maxey had actually commanded FitzClarence in peacetime when FitzClarence was in charge of First Irish Guards. The two had actually got on very well, and Maxey had spoken highly of FitzClarence's ability. But Maxey had a difficult start to the First World War. First of all, he lost the 2nd Munster Fusiliers at the rearguard action at Ypres on the 22nd of August 1914. And then he led First Guards Brigade into what was described at the time as a right smash-up at the Aisne, trying to storm the sugar factory in the early part of that action, which left First Guards Brigade badly bruised, heavily blooded, and with heavy casualties. And Max's struggles in the early part of the First World War led to him being relieved of command. He was actually kicked upstairs. He was taken from First Guards Brigade. He was placed in charge of the newly formed 18th Division. This creates an opportunity for the Guards Brigade could only be commanded by a guardsman, and FitzClarence seemed the ideal candidate. And indeed, he was sent to command 1st Guards Brigade in September 1914, receiving news of the posting on the 22nd of September, arriving in France 5 days later on the 27th. It's a rather blurred photograph, but you can just see FitzClarence sat up here at his dugout on the Aisne. FitzClarence inherited a battle-worn, bruised formation, but he brought with him a certain energy and intensity that the brigade needed. His staff captain, Andrew Thorne, affectionately nicknamed Bulgy, who would go on to have a very impressive career in both the First and the Second World Wars, young officer in 1914, remembered his excitement at the fact that FitzClarence, one of Britain's most famous fighting soldiers, had been put in charge of the brigade. He noted that our new brigadier is a great man. We're jolly lucky to have him. FitzClarence immediately set about reinvigorating 1st Guards Brigade and putting some of his experiences that he gained in the Boer War to good use. And as part of that, on the night of the 4th and 5th of October, he ordered the first trench raid of the First World War on a German position at the Aisne known as Fishhook Trench, sending out a raiding party under Merston Beckwith Smith, a young lieutenant, to go and seize and scupper a German French line trench, wipe out the garrison and hopefully demolish the trench itself. The raid went in successfully. The garrison was overwhelmed and the British were able to fall back, but unfortunately before the demolitions could be carried out. But nevertheless, it was a promising start for Britain's trench raiding operations, and one that FitzClarence planned to repeat on a much larger scale later in the month. In fact, he actually wrote to Commander-in-Chief Sir John French asking for various specialist trench raiding supplies to be provided to him, including rifle grenades, steel plates to be placed in his own trenches, and demolition equipment that he could use to have his troops destroy German trenches in front of them once they gained entry to them. And although he never explicitly acknowledged the influence of his Boer War trench raiding, one cannot help but think that it must have played something of a role in his eagerness to have 1st Guards Brigade undertake raids at this stage. It also had something to his belief that it would help to improve the morale of the rather blooded and stunned Guards Brigade, which was still recovering from its heavy losses at the Battle of the Aisne earlier in September. It's also set down a marker about the type of commander that FitzClarence was going to be for the remainder of his military career: aggressive, dynamic, forward-thinking, and, dare I say it, willing to take risks. FitzClarence's dreams of carrying out additional trench raids on the Aisne were, of course, hampered, or indeed ended, because the British Army had other plans. Instead, the assault, or the fulcrum of battle, was going to move from the Aisne, which is to the south. It's actually off this map, and instead we're going to swing to the north. It was going to move to the north. It was going to swing up to in what became known as the Race to the Sea, as both Allies and Central Powers forces attempted to outflank one another, this constant lunge for the flanks, one after the next, until eventually the coast was reached. And although the Allies began this campaign in the hope of fighting their way all the way to Brussels and Antwerp, not just at the top of your map here, this was matched by German intentions of fighting through Belgium in the opposite direction and breaking through to the channel ports of Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne, just off this map here. The stage was set for a vast battle then in Flanders fields, and it pitted multiple Allied armies against oncoming German forces. Although I'm going to be discussing the Battle of Ypres from a very British perspective, this was also an intense battle involving the Belgian army, the French army, the Indian army, as well as the British army. And it was the British army, alongside French allies, that found itself at the fulcrum of the action, at the gates of Ypres itself in 1914. Ypres needed to be taken by the oncoming German offensive. If they could seize Ypres, the road network that spread out from Ypres would allow ready access to these crucial channel ports, which the Germans intended to seize to try and disrupt or even cut off the British Expeditionary Force in France from its sources of supply back in the United Kingdom. Ypres could not be allowed, therefore, to fall into German hands. And although there's an argument that Ypres later became important because of its symbolic value, in 1914, it had both symbolic and very real military value. And the Allies were determined it would not fall into German hands. And as part of Douglas Haig's First Corps, and specifically part of 1st Division of 1st Corps, 1st Guards Brigade and FitzClarence moved to the Ypres front in mid-October and prepared to take their place in the fighting line. The situation around Ypres at this time was extremely chaotic. The fighting here was truly intense. As you can see from French forces to the north of Ypres, with British forces in the centre and in the south. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the importance of the Menin Road here, a straight road that ran from Menin, of course, into German control, straight through relatively difficult terrain, quite wooded, quite boggy in places, over the Gellivelt Plateau and into the German objective of Ypres itself. It meant that the Menin Road itself became a fulcrum of battle during this period. The Germans were determined to take advantage of the road as the most direct route to Ypres, and the British, of course, were determined to defend the approaches to that road. This map doesn't show it, but the importance of high ground here should also be noted. Of course, this area is very flat and relatively small rises, relatively small elevated ground makes a huge difference to the defender's position, makes it an enormous contribution to how the defense can be manned. The Gellivelt Plateau, of course, to become notorious in 1917 was here, and the British were hoping to hold on to that plateau as it gave observation of oncoming German attacks to the south and allowed artillery fire to be directed against this, of course, the region of the Menin Rage. The position around Gellivelt, though, was heavily exposed. The British line here was very, very thinly held. Oncoming German assaults were extremely heavy, and the Germans were able to muster an enormous preponderance of guns, especially guns that had been freed up from siege work at places like Antwerp, could now be brought to the front and directed against the British positions here. To this, the Royal Artillery had few recourses, few responses. It was short of ammunition. It was short of guns, in fact, at this stage. And it had to husband every shell for directing against the inevitable German infantry attacks. What even the odds somewhat was, of course, the sheer dogged determination of the British in this sector to hold the line. This is really where the old Contemptibles, that legendary army of tough professionals, really starts to achieve its legendary reputation, because they are forced to rely upon their own firepower from rifles and machine guns to try and halt heavy German assaults, which are delivered frequently, almost daily. There's almost no significant lulls in the fighting during this period at the Battle of Ypres, with the Germans pressing down that road, pressing the British and indeed the French forces wherever they can, looking to close in on Ypres, because once Ypres is taken, it can be used as a launch pad, as a springboard, which will give them access to the rest of the Channel ports and will, of course, be of absolutely crucial importance to their success. And to give you a feeling for the nature of the fighting in this period, I'd like to turn to James Edmonds, the British official historian, a man who's often accused of writing in dull or very measured terms, an accusation that's not entirely true, because I think his description of the conditions at Ypres are worth repeating. He wrote in the official history, "It must be remembered that the fighting was almost continuous, hardly interrupted at night, and that the troops had no rest. Many successful repulses by fire of German attacks received no mention in the war diaries because they were regarded as a matter of course. To give a true picture of the long hours of patient and stubborn resistance, there should be some mention on almost every page of bursting shells, blown-in trenches, hunger, fatigue, death, and wounds. The troops must be imagined as fighting in small groups, scattered along the front in shallow trenches, often separated by gaps amounting to 200, 300, or even 400 yards. Many an officer fell in attempting to get from one group to another." This was the nature then of combat at the front line during the height of the Battle of Ypres. And it was here that FitzClarence's Guards Brigade and FitzClarence himself were to achieve their legend. First Division, which of course held Guards Brigade, was positioned here just across the Menin Road directly, screening the small Belgian village of Gellivelt, a small farming hamlet essentially with a pre-war population of about 1,000 inhabitants. Gellivelt represented the last major obstacle to the German advance down this road. It sat astride the Gellivelt Plateau. The village itself was somewhat defensible, as was the ground around it. Indeed, the slightly unusual shape of the British line here was to conform to high ground. The Germans knew if they could break through and seize Gellivelt, then the road to Ypres was essentially open. There was only the small village of Hooge that lay on their path. Otherwise, it was an approximately straightforward 4-mile advance from Gellivelt to Ypres itself. On the 29th of October, a massive German assault had captured Gellivelt Crossroads, marked on your map here, and destroyed the Coldstream Guards, part of 1st Guards Brigade, who became encircled and were wiped out in the fighting. There was then a lull on the 30th of October as fresh German forces were brought up to prepare the hammer blow that would break this thin line here, capture Gellivelt, open up the defences and move on to Ypres. So confident were the Germans that a breakthrough was imminent that the Kaiser himself came to Erich von Falkenhayn, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army at this stage, came to his headquarters on the evening of the 30th of October, ready apparently to lead the victorious German army astride a white horse through the gates of Ypres itself. So the Kaiser was here expecting a crushing victory to be won on the 31st of October. And indeed, the scene was set for just such a victory. The Germans had mustered 2 comparatively fresh divisions, 30th and 54th Reserve, to strike this very, very narrow point of the British line. Against it was 1st Division, but by now reduced to well below half strength. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Brigade holding a very thin, haggard line. As James Edmonds remembered, the line that stood between the British Empire and ruin was composed of tired, haggard men, many in little more than rags at this stage, and backed by their largest concentration of artillery that had been assembled for this point, up to this point in the war, against the British army. The Germans launched an enormous assault on the 31st of October, beginning at dawn with a murderous barrage from their guns. And this led to, quite simply, an inferno along the British line, pulverized by shells, shrapnel, and high explosive through dawn. And then, about an hour after that bombardment began, an infantry assault came thundering out of the mist. Heavy German assault columns crashing into that thin British line, which dug in, gritted their teeth, and did their best to repulse them with rifle and machine gun fire. Despite the thinness of the British line, despite the tremendous pounding the British line had taken from artillery, the line held against this initial assault and actually gunned down the oncoming German assault columns, repulsed the attack. But the Germans were able to gain some lodgements near to the British position, crucially in wooded terrain that was nearby, which would serve as a useful jumping off point for a future assault. Bear in mind that the Kaiser was at German headquarters. There was no prospect of calling off the assault. And even though it had been bloodily repulsed in its first instance, there was a pause, there was a call for a renewed artillery bombardment from the German artillery, and then the attack would go in again. The second bombardment was even more ferocious than the first. By now, early morning mist had blown clear. Early morning drizzle had given way to dull but bright weather. German artillery observation was much better, and all artillery restrictions, all ammunition restrictions on their guns were lifted. They were able to fire as fast and as furiously as they could, this time with the benefit of better observation. And the British line was absolutely blanketed in shells, shrapnel, and high explosive. And in the aftermath of this, a second German infantry assault went in, and this time it was able to crack the British line, advancing from a lodgement that it had to the south of the British line, specifically the south of 3rd Brigade. It was able to get in, break onto the high ground, and then turning north and turning south, it was able to roll up that thin British line, breaking 3rd Brigade and forcing 2nd Brigade to the south and 1st Guards Brigade to the north away from each other, creating a huge rift in front of Gellivelt and indeed surging onwards into Gellivelt itself. The situation was quite simply disastrous for the British. The line had been broken and there was almost no one and nothing behind this position to stop it. Indeed, when Field Marshal Sir John French learned that his line had been broken at Gelliveld, he confessed that it was quite simply the worst moment of his life, and that he feared that the very last barrier between the Germans and the Channel coast had been broken down. He raced away, looking to reach the French to ask for assistance. Meanwhile, Douglas Haig, for it was, of course, his corps that was involved in the thick of the action, sought the opinion of his divisional commanders. But disaster was compounded by further misfortune. The Germans captured Gelliveld somewhere between 12 p.m. and 1 p.m. At about 1:15 p.m., a crisis conference of British divisional commanders, Samuel Lomax of 1st Division and Charles Munro of 2nd Division, was taking place in Hooge Chateau, further up the line. But the concentration of staff cars outside the chateau attracted the notice of a German spotter aircraft, which returned back to its artillery batteries, and soon after, a salvo of high explosive shells ploughed into Hooge Chateau, where the conference was taking place, mortally wounding Lomax. He'd actually died of his wounds in 1915, and knocking Munro unconscious. And although Munro did regain his consciousness, he was stunned and concussed and was in no position to direct the battle. Not only had the British line been broken, but the British chain of command had been broken at a crucial moment, with both divisional commanders disabled. Haig actually sent word down to the front line to put the commander of 3rd Brigade, the commander of 2nd Brigade, Edward Bulfin, into command of the division. But Bulfin couldn't be detached from his own 2nd Brigade. He was fighting for his life. So instead, it was requested that Herman Landon, 3rd Brigade, was placed in charge, but nobody could find Landon. His brigade had been broken. He was fighting for his life as well. And so Haig, with no way to get orders to the front line, actually mounted his horse and started to head down the Menin Road to take direct charge of the battle himself in a celebrated and to this day somewhat controversial maneuver. It seemed as if the BF was about to be engulfed by disaster. But it was at this point that the demon took charge. And just to orient ourselves here, we've got the British position at the outset of the battle. This is 3rd Brigade, occupying area around the Gelliveld Plateau. Of course, you've got Gelliveld itself here. 1st Brigade was fighting in this direction, and 2nd Brigade was down here holding this position. The Germans had broken into this area here, and then they turned in both directions, north and south, and started to roll up the British line, as well as moving into Gelliveld itself. But the Germans did not have complete control over this area. 1st Brigade had fallen back into the woods. 2nd Brigade had fallen back and would be in a position to fight a counterattack later in the day. Crucially, this area here, this is Gelliveld Chateau, was not in German hands. The 1st South Wales Borderers had fallen back into Gelliveld Chateau, taking with them some stragglers from other battalions who'd become separated. The chateau was a tall, very sturdy brick building, which had resisted several German shell hits in the early part of the action. It would clearly take some time for the Germans to capture this position, and the South Wales Borderers prepared to defend it and indeed sell their lives dearly, barricading the doors, loopholing the walls, positioning themselves at the windows of the chateau, and firing back at the Germans who were starting to move to the chateau grounds and encircle them. So although the Germans were in Gelliveld, they were also trying to reduce this position and overwhelm it here. It was in the midst of this that a stroke of good fortune fell upon the British. And this was the fact that there was apparently a telephone line operable from the chateau to FitzClarence's headquarters, which was somewhere around here. The exact location of FitzClarence's headquarters are not entirely clear. But apparently the commander of the South Wales Borderers, Colonel Leach, was able to get in touch with FitzClarence and alert him to the situation, that he had men hanging on in the chateau, that the Germans were closing in on him, but that he was fighting ferociously. FitzClarence briefly considered ordering Leach and his men to evacuate the chateau and fall back to join up with 1st Guards Brigade here. But he quickly abandoned the idea, and instead he decided that an immediate counterattack would be made. The problem was where to find the troops to do it. 1st Guards Brigade had been heavily engaged all day, and they'd been pushed back to the north. They were still under pressure. He could not afford to detach a battalion from them to send swinging down towards Gelliveld. Where else could he find reinforcements and reserves? The answer was to be found here at Polderhoek Wood, where the last reserve battalion of the British Army, the 2nd Worcestershires, were to be found. And on that day, they were under the command of this man, Major Edward Hankey, later, of course, become a tank officer with a wonderful nickname, Hankey the Tanky. But at this stage, a major in charge of a much reduced battalion. The 2nd Worcesters had been reduced to 12 officers and 480 men by previous fighting. They'd suffered, therefore, almost 50% casualties up to this stage of the battle. The Worcestershires were actually part of 2nd Division, not 1st Division, which, of course, was FitzClarence's division. And strictly speaking, FitzClarence had no authority over Hankey or his battalion. FitzClarence, indeed, was a strange and essentially unknown officer to Hankey when the two men encountered one another. FitzClarence knew the 2nd Worcestershires were in the area. He'd been told of their presence earlier in the morning, but Hankey had no idea what the Worcestershires' role in this battle were. He had actually been placed in reserve. He knew that he might be called upon a reserve, but he had no idea who was in charge of him. And he essentially had no idea of the situation in front of him. He could see a tremendous battle raging around Gheluvelt. Gheluvelt itself was ablaze by mid-afternoon or early afternoon. Broken and wounded men were falling back through Hankey's position. There was clearly an intense battle going on, but he wasn't sure of who had authority over him. And in the midst of this, FitzClarence appears and actually gave Hankey instructions, briefed him on the situation, and told him of his plan to launch a counterattack. Initially, Hankey was reluctant to accept instruction from FitzClarence. He didn't know FitzClarence. FitzClarence had no formal authority over him. And here we have a wonderful bit of British understatement. Hankey was resisting FitzClarence's instructions until, in Hankey's own words, FitzClarence took him to one side, away from the rest of the men, and went into things very thoroughly. And I think that sentence carries a great deal of weight. Remember, this is a man who's known as the demon, who has a fearsome reputation. And one can well imagine what he may have said to convince Hankey that his plan was correct and he had authority over this battalion. FitzClarence's plan was for the Worcesters to counterattack towards Gheluvelt Chateau, relieve the defenders of the chateau, and then use that momentum to go into Gheluvelt village itself and clear the Germans from out there. The odds seemed massively stacked against the Worcesters. They'd begun the day with 12 officers and 480 men. By the time FitzClarence found Hankey, this had been reduced to 8 officers and 370 men. A company of the Worcesters had been detached to cover the road. So Hankey only had 3 companies under his command, 3 much reduced companies. They would be attacking essentially into the unknown. All that was known was that a massive German force had overwhelmed the defenders around Gheluvelt and had broken the line. But the odds were not completely against them. FitzClarence reasoned that the German attackers would be distracted by their need to besiege the chateau, and that also they might be in that dangerous state of relaxation that sometimes comes upon soldiers when they feel a battle is won and they're not prepared for a sudden counterattack. It was a faint hope, but it was the only hope that the British seemed to have. They could either abandon the position and retreat back, and at what point did they stop? With so few reserves in hand and so many brigades engaged, it could be a retreat to the gates of Ypres itself, or they could counterattack and try and stem the tide of the German advance. It was a counterattack that was chosen in the end. FitzClarence briefed Hankey, instructs him on the ground. He pointed out the aiming points, the primary one of which was Gheluvelt Church steeple, instructed him, and then gave him a direct order to commence an immediate counterattack and to retake the village of Gheluvelt. The counterattack had to cover several hundred yards across heavy agricultural fields. These were damp, primarily turnips and mangolds here, with sticky mud that stuck to the soldiers' boots. Crucially, there was effectively no cover, and this meant that the Worcesters had to advance in one long rush over several hundred yards, moving through the woodlands that actually ringed the chateau, into the grounds of the chateau, and to relieve the South Wales borderers. It had to be done in one long rush. Hankey led from the front. He had a hunting horn in his hand. At some point, he'd lost his whistle and all he had was a hunting horn, which he used to make himself heard. His own terse memories of the attack were falling men, deafening noise, and bellowing commands. Almost as soon as the Worcesters set out from Polderhook across this ground, they were taken under fire by the Germans, primarily German artillery. There must have been a German forward observer with a telephone somewhere in this region who was able to bring shrapnel fire down onto the Worcesters as they sprinted across this heavy ground. Over 100 men of the Worcester Regiment fell crossing this ground alone. Remember, they're only starting with under 400 men, so this was almost 25% casualties just crossing this deadly ground. But cross it they did, get into the tree line at the edge of Gellivelt Chateau, and then burst from the tree line into the ground, into the gardens of Gellivelt Chateau, surprising the Germans there. Hankey himself remembered the incongruous sight of seeing Germans fighting in greenhouses and in flower beds. But the Germans were completely surprised by the ferocity of this counterattack. They've been focusing all their attentions on besieging the chateau, and suddenly to have the Worcesters coming bursting out of the wood line and attacking them in the flank was too much for the Germans, who were startled and frightened by this sudden counterattack, unsure of exactly who was attacking them or in what strength they were. And the attackers around the chateau, the German attackers, broke and ran and were driven back out of the chateau grounds, retreating some distance away and not being rallied effectively for the remainder of the day. The timing of this attack, somewhat unclear, somewhere between around about 2:15 and 3 p.m. People were not taking very close notices of the time at this battle, as one can well imagine. And the Worcesters burst into the chateau grounds, drove the Germans back, and initially the South Wales borderers firing from the windows were not sure what had happened. But then there was a pause as it became clear that they were being relieved, and then there was tremendous cheering from the loopholes and the windows. Hankey and the Worcesters, Hankey had survived the charge, were able to link up with the survivors at the chateau, giving rise to this famous painting, which actually shows Hankey himself stood in the center here, the chateau in the background. Of course, they've cleared the grounds here and they've retaken the chateau. Hankey actually met with Colonel Leach, commanding the South Wales borderers. The two men had been pre-war friends, and Hankey greeted him with an awfully British, "My God, fancy meeting you here." Leach, who was badly wounded and who was expecting his position to be overwhelmed at almost any moment, replied with a rather terser, "Thank God you have come." But the job was only partially completed. The Worcesters had relieved the chateau, but Hankey now had to reorganize his fighting troops and move through the grounds of the chateau to the edge of Gellivelt. And if we go back a slide here, we can see the way the grounds work. The chateau had been relieved. The Worcesters then moved down to this area and then launched themselves from the flank of Gellivelt into the village itself, an advantageous direction of attack, for it took the German defenders by surprise again, for they were mainly looking down the road, expecting any counterattack to come from that direction. The counterattack into the village was just as successful as the counterattack into the chateau grounds. German forces in the village were in a severe state of disorganisation. According to some British accounts, the Germans were busy looting the town, and that may have been the case. What certainly was the case was the Germans had lost a very large number of officers and NCOs in the morning's fighting. Remember, their first attack had been repulsed, and even the second attack had been hard fought. The troops that were left were not under full control of the officers that were in the town and were rather isolated, rather stretched thin. And so when the Worcesters counterattack burst in from the flank, German soldiers were taken by surprise, thinking they were under attack from a much larger force, retreated back to the town, taking other German soldiers with them, who of course saw this rout taking place and joined it and fled back. There weren't enough German officers or NCOs to re-establish any real control over this battle, and there were only a handful of pockets of German resistance clinging on in the odd building, mainly on the south side of Gellivelt, to contest the Worcesters' control of the village. The chateau had been retaken, the village had been retaken, and remarkably, defeat had been staved off, and victory had been snatched from the jaws of defeat. The Worcesters clung on in the ruins of Gellivelt village for the remainder of the afternoon. Hankey sent back to FitzClarence asking for reinforcements and was rather alarmed to realise that he was the only reinforcement. There was nobody left that FitzClarence would send through. It meant that Gellivelt itself became something of a no man's land. The Worcesters falling back to the north end of Gellivelt, some Germans in the southern end, the artillery of both sides pounding the village remorselessly, setting it on fire and reducing it to ruins. In the late afternoon and the early evening, FitzClarence withdrew the survivors from Gheluvelt and from around the chateau and fell back a little bit further to the north, where a new British defensive line was being established. But crucially, this counterattack had turned the tide at an essential moment for the British. This was a moment when, for a short window of opportunity, the British line was broken and there was an opportunity for the Germans to push along that road and perhaps fulfill the Kaiser's ambition of riding into Ypres astride a white horse. But the window had been closed by the swift action of FitzClarence in identifying the opportunity for a counterattack, finding the reserves in the case of the Worcesters, and then ordering Hankey to carry it out, as well as the courage and determination of the 1st South Wales Borderers defending the chateau, not to mention, of course, the courage of Hankey and the 2nd Worcesters, who led the gallant charge that turned back the German tide. The success of the Gheluvelt counterattack restabilized the British line, but FitzClarence's role in this counterattack, organising it and ordering it, was not immediately recognised, for the battle did not end with the Battle of Gheluvelt. The Kaiser went home disappointed. He did not get to ride into Ypres. But the battle continued. Falkenhayn still believed he had opportunity to break the British line. On the 11th of November, he threw his last reserves in to try and do just that. This was the famed attack of the Prussian Guard, the social, cultural, and military elite of the German army, attempting to break through with one last great heave, one last throw of the dice, only, of course, to be repulsed, including the famous charge of the 2nd Oxen Bucks at Nombrechen, as pictured here in the painting. FitzClarence's 1st Guards Brigade fought on, now reduced to perhaps fewer than 300 officers and men from a paper strength of 4,000 by which it should have begun the campaign. It gives you some idea of the intense fighting at Ypres. The 1st Guards Brigade had suffered effectively 90% casualties by the time of the last major battle of this campaign. FitzClarence's 1st Guards Brigade fought very hard on the 11th of November. The German assault was halted and in most places repulsed. On the evening of this final great battle, the weather closed in around the British position. It was a storm-racked night. A winter storm was howling around the position. And yet FitzClarence was not satisfied with the work that his Guards Brigade had been done. His brigade had been driven out of some trenches, which he desired to retake in a daring nighttime trench raid, reasoning again that the Germans would be exhausted, disorganized, and they would not be expecting a trench raid in such foul weather. He prepared to make a night sortie. And here, fate took a cruel twist, because he was assigned reinforcements to undertake this night raid, including his beloved 1st Irish Guards, the unit, of course, he'd always dreamt of leading into battle. And FitzClarence could not resist the temptation to lead the 1st Irish Guards personally into their position where they will be launching their counterattack. Exactly what happened next remains disputed. Our best account of it suggests that one of the Irish Guardsmen stumbled in the dark and accidentally discharged his rifle into the air. This made the Germans occupying the trenches, remember visibility is near zero, the Germans in front of the raiders became nervous and fired a few shots into the darkness. FitzClarence halted the advancing column, got them to kneel down to pause, and then he went forward personally to take a closer look at the German trenches. He went forward, but there was a burst of fire from the German trenches, and the officers who FitzClarence had accompanied with it remembered that FitzClarence fell dead from a single shot. A bullet had gone straight through his head and killed him instantly. FitzClarence's body was brought back from the front. The trench raid was abandoned. Ideally, or perhaps for the best, it should never have been launched in the first place. But the body of FitzClarence was brought back from the front, and it was buried in haste. And it meant that the exact location of where he was buried, remember it's a storm-racked night, was not properly marked. And so it was his body became one of the missing of Ypres, along with the many tens of thousands who, of course, are commemorated on the Menin Gate. His loss in this tragic circumstance at the very end of major operations, the Battle of Ypres, was keenly felt around the army. He achieved a remarkable reputation for courage, bravery, and determination at this battle. Indeed, one of his enemies, Prince Eitel Friedrich, one of the Kaiser's sons, the second son, in fact, of the Kaiser, who was commanding First Prussian Foot Guards on this day, actually sent a message of condolence, reflecting on the death of FitzClarence, and noted he was an opponent before whom we will dip our swords in respectful salute. The loss of Charles FitzClarence was felt keenly by the army. One of the British Army's most brilliant brigadier generals, who could perhaps have gone on to have an even more glittering military career had he not been snatched from life at the moment that he was. Indeed, at the moment of death, his role in the Gheluvelt counterattack was poorly understood. It was only during an investigation into exactly what had happened at Gheluvelt that was undertaken during the Lullin operations in winter 1914-15 that FitzClarence's pivotal role was identified. And so impressed was Haig by the actions of FitzClarence that he retrospectively ordered evidence describing what FitzClarence had done to be placed into the First Corps and First Division's war diaries to give a full account of exactly what had happened. And in doing this, the evidence of Edward Hankey, of course, had survived the battle and had survived the war, was absolutely crucial. But the loss of FitzClarence was a heavy blow. He remains the highest ranked officer commemorated on the Menin Gate. Next time you visit there, perhaps you'll look into that corner and see his name high above, Brigadier-General C. FitzClarence. His loss was also felt keenly by those who knew him best. I mentioned earlier his staff captain, Andrew Bolgie Thorne, who had formed a powerful bond with FitzClarence, even though they'd known each other for only just over a month, of course, meeting at first in the Battle of the Aisne. And I think the most touching tribute to the loss of FitzClarence was actually provided by Thorne, who wrote to his wife soon after, indeed the day after FitzClarence's death. And he refers here to Charles Cochrane, who was the brigade major of First Guards Brigade. And he wrote this: "Charles and I are nearly heartbroken. He was such a splendid man to serve and a glorious one to follow. I hadn't known him intimately for long, but he was one you would follow directly he came along and gave you the order. He was so splendid." And for a man who'd only known FitzClarence for just over a month, and for a man who, in his letters to his wife, epitomized the stiff upper lip that's almost a stereotype of British officers of this day, for Thorne to speak so frankly and so openly about the loss of FitzClarence tells you something about the bond he'd formed with his commander. The loss of FitzClarence was a great blow to the army, but his role in stemming the German tide and turning back the Kaiser's advancing forces at the Battle of Gheluvelt, the battle for Gheluvelt, was pivotal in ensuring an Allied victory at First Ypres, a victory which ultimately reshaped the nature of the Western Front. And as Michael Howard, himself a courageous soldier, of course, holder of the Military Cross, as Michael Howard noted, German victory at Ypres may have ended the First World War in a maneuver worthy of Napoleon, but even if it had not done, a German victory would likely have led to a war of Napoleonic duration. The fact that FitzClarence, Hankey, the Worcesters, and the South Wales borderers were able to stop this ensured that victory would ultimately proceed to the Allies. And it was not without reason that FitzClarence became known, as I mentioned at the start of this tour, in the 1920s as the man who saved the empire, and the Worcester's counterattack as the attack which saved the empire. The stakes were enormous, but men such as FitzClarence and Hankey rose to the challenge. It wouldn't be one of my talks without some comment about further reading, and I'm afraid it's wearisomely predictable, but if you'd like to read a lot more about FitzClarence, I wrote a biography of him for my edited volume, Stemming the Tide, which includes a lot more detail about his life, about his pre-war military career, and indeed about his interactions with Hankey, Thorne, and others at the Battle for Gheluvelt. It's part of course, the edited collection Stemming the Tide, and this also includes a contribution from my great friend and colleague, Michael Le Cicero, who wrote about Edward Bulfin, who was commanding 2nd Brigade, which was fighting to the south of FitzClarence's position, and which also played a crucial role in repelling the German assault on the 31st of October. And handily enough, The book is just about to enter a new paperback printing. In fact, it's out now, the new paperback edition. So if you haven't already picked up a copy, now is the perfect time. So I hope that if I've interested you in this talk and you'd like to know more about the life and times of Charles FitzClarence and his contemporary officers, do consider picking up a copy of Stemming the Tide. I'll be very happy to have any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Spencer. That was extremely entertaining, very interesting, and very informative. And in the usual manner, people are anticipating this already. If you want to press the raise hands button as a silent round of applause, please do so. Everybody knows the score now, and the hands were shooting up before I even said that. So there's a deafening silent round of applause going for you right now, Spencer. So thanks for that. It's Q&A time. The first questions come in, and I know Terry Jackson doesn't normally have a video or microphone working. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to ask Terry's question for him. Terry asks, this is in the run-up to First Ypres. In the race to the sea, did the Germans use the fact that they were on enemy territory to select the best positions and invite the enemy, i.e. the British, to attack to try to recover their own land? That's Terry Jackson's question.
In the race to the sea, not initially. The race to the sea was built on, of course, German offensive too. The Germans really hoped to break through to get to the Channel ports, already identifying the threat that the British Army would pose in a longer war. And so the initial German move in the race to the sea was aggressive. But of course, as the battle lines became static, one thing that the Germans could do, which was not an option available to the British, Belgians, or French, was the Germans could make relatively small tactical withdrawals. And I think that's what you're referring to. Whereas the Allies became locked to the idea of not surrendering another yard of Belgian or French territory for obvious reasons. The Germans could and indeed did surrender portions of territory they occupied. They could afford to fall back several hundred or even several thousand yards back to more advantageous positions, back to the high ground. And of course, that would, anybody who's visited the Western Front, one of the great features of the Western Front is how often the Allies were attacking uphill, as I'm sure you've experienced. Around Ypres, in actual fact, the British began occupying the high ground. When I say high ground, of course, those of you who've been to Flanders know that it's only really noticeable when you're stood on it and you're looking down. But the British had started occupying that sort of territory, the Messines Ridge and so forth, but had gradually been driven off it by the German advance. And then that driving off from the high ground was completed, of course, at this second Battle of Ypres in April and May 1915, which explains why the Germans are the high ground in 1917. But in terms of tactical withdrawals in this period, not too many are in evidence, because the Germans were pressing the attack and were determined to try and break through. But those rearrangement of the lines would occur later as the Germans took a more defensive posture.
Great, thanks for that, Spencer. Right, first live question from John Azar. John, hello there.
Hi there. Well, thank you for that, Spencer. That was terrific. My question's around the relationship, chain of command and rank. Now that FitzClarence-Hankey interaction was critical to this. Now, if Hankey wasn't as confused and he knew who his immediate commander was, and he had to wait to get instructions from them, that would have delayed his involvement in this. So what was the dynamic like of this cross chain of command versus your immediate senior officer and that kind of cooperation? There must have been some terrible disasters because of confusion, and then this one was really critical.
It's a really good question, and the answer is a little bit complicated, because the British Army acknowledged that there was a possibility, and this came from its colonial experience, that chains of command might get confused, orders might have to be given very hastily, and that it was possible for officers who didn't have strict authority over units to take charge of them. Hankey's confusion stemmed from two things. He'd been told at the start of the day that he was a reserve and that he could be given instructions to go into action, but nobody had told him who he was to expect those instructions from. That was the problem number one. Problem number two was that Hankey was, in inverted commas, only a major. and he happened to be commanding the battalion on that day. He was a relatively junior officer. You wouldn't normally expect a major to be in charge of a battalion, even a half-strength battalion. And so he was probably feeling the weight of responsibility a little bit more. And the third feature was that nobody had given Hankey any information for the entirety of the day until FitzClarence happened to find him. And so he'd been waiting anxiously, and I can only begin to imagine the nerves he must have been feeling. He's not getting any instructions. No one's telling him anything. You can see this huge battle raging in front of him. He doesn't really know what's going on. And then suddenly this unknown officer comes riding up to him and says, I'm in charge of you. You're going to do this. And so any hesitancy on Hankey's part is understandable. Now, strictly speaking, this was in keeping with British Army traditions. It was in keeping with British Army doctrine as enshrined by field service regulations that the man on the spot could show initiative and could seize the day. But I think in Hankey's case, he was just so anxious about the overall situation. And if we look at it from Hankey's perspective, suddenly an officer he doesn't know from a unit that he's not attached to rides up and says, I'm sending your battalion into a counterattack, which Hankey, as far as Hankey can see, it's a disaster in front of him. And suddenly the FitzClarence is saying, and you're going to attack, you can understand the hesitancy. And so there was a risk here, of course, of a real foul up in the chain of command. But that moment where FitzClarence, in Hankey's words, went into everything quite thoroughly, settled the matter. And as I say, I'd be fascinated to know exactly what was said there, especially given FitzClarence's reputation. But that cleared Hankey of any doubts. And of course, he led the attack very bravely. So in a way, it's the system working, and yet at the same time, remember the personal factors that it's one thing to have a system, it's another thing to actually implement that system in the most chaotic situation imaginable.
Thank you.
Thanks, Spencer.
Well, just maybe to add, if he did know who his commanding officer was, and he had orders, and he couldn't reach him, is he still feeling conflicted by having this officer from another line of command?
I think he would, because he'd be naturally waiting for something to come down from the officers that he knew, and instead a new one appears and says, here's the situation, this is what we're going to do. So I think he would feel that tension, especially as a young officer. You're only a relatively junior major. He's feeling that pressure, but he did the right thing in the end. He followed the instructions to the letter.
Well, it speaks a lot to FitzClarence making his argument. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that. Right, just three quick firers here. Spencer, we've got Evelyn Webb Carter on the line saying he's not got a question, but he thought the talk was marvellous. Bulgy Tom Thorne is his wife's grandfather. So we've got
fantastic. That's interesting family connection. That's wonderful.
A question, two quick questions. One from Francois Wicart. When did FitzClarence receive his VC? And a question from Steve Mason, who hasn't got a camera. Do you happen to know if Field Marshal Alexander had any recollections of FitzClarence as he was an Irish Guards officer at the time?
So when did he receive his VC? I would have to double check, but I think it was presented to him in August 1900, because of course he was trapped in Mafeking until May, so was not in a position. Then there had to be a recommendation and so forth, and it was presented to him directly by Lord Roberts in South Africa in the field. But I'd have to double check the citation. Incidentally, FitzClarence's VC is part of the Ashcroft Gallery at the Imperial War Museum. So next time you're in the area and you visit it, you can go and see his medal. Alexander and FitzClarence, only very brief recollections of him, and that was turn up in my research just the briefest recollection of FitzClarence, and that he was a towering Irish guardsman, 6'2", obviously a tall man, who embodied the best features of the British Army. Alexander only speaks very briefly about FitzClarence, but speaks highly of him, as indeed nearly all of FitzClarence's contemporaries did. This was a man, unusually, in fact, in the pre-war army, which could be given to a little bit of gossip, a little bit of cliques. Everybody seemed to have a good word for FitzClarence. He was extremely admired, widely admired, both professionally and personally, by his contemporaries, both those above him, below him, and those at the same level of him. And that's comparatively rare in the British Army at the time. FitzClarence was clearly a superb officer of this era.
Super. Thanks for that, Spencer. Right, Jonathan Davey, you know, unmute yourself.
Hi, Spencer. That was great. Thank you very much indeed. Great to be back in 1914. This is a quick one about getting back to the battlefields, hopefully sometime this year. Just looking at linesmen there, I see between Glencorse Wood and Inverness Copse, there's a FitzClarence farm. How close do you reckon that is to where he was killed on the night, the 11th of 12th?
Now, that's a really interesting question, Jonathan, because FitzClarence Farm is one of those little mysteries. And perhaps this is something that somebody may even be able to give me information about, because one of the sort of the sadder things about FitzClarence's death is, in common with many soldiers, wives, mothers, sisters, relatives, in common with many soldiers who were missing, there was a concerted effort by FitzClarence's wife to try and find his burial place in the 1920s. And there's a whole host of correspondence about this. Very sad, of course, very tragic, including Thorne, of course, who survived the war, was well connected. And various people say, oh, we think he was buried near FitzClarence Farm because that was his headquarters in 1914. But Thorne, who of course knew it best for, he writes back and he says, no, FitzClarence Farm wasn't the farm we used. It was named after. And Thorne himself wasn't sure where the name had come from. Perhaps it was named in honor of FitzClarence or so on. But Thorne was very clear that FitzClarence Farm was not FitzClarence's headquarters and that he was not buried near there. So exactly how the name FitzClarence Farm came to be, I honestly don't know, and the correspondence didn't shed any light on it. But that's one of those interesting little mysteries. Exactly where FitzClarence's headquarters was is also somewhat unclear. Thorne couldn't place it exactly. Some of the other contemporaries, Cochrane, who worked with FitzClarence, couldn't place it either. But they all said it wasn't FitzClarence Farm. That came later. So I'd be intrigued if anybody knows the origin of FitzClarence Farm. Drop me an email, or drop me a line on Twitter. I'd love to hear.
I was going to say, because where it is doesn't really quite fit in with the movements on the 11th and 12th of November, does it? So that's just...
So where the name came from, I have no earthly idea, but I'd be really interested if anybody's got any insight into that. Please do drop me a line. I'd love to know.
Dissertation in that one, I think. Thanks very much, Spencer.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Jonathan. Paul Mitchell, unmute yourself.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks, Spencer. That's fantastic. Just start, I guess, I overheard the conversation you and David early on. So, you can always support Brighton and Hove Albion rather than West Brom Albion. If that's, I'm wearing the badge tonight. There you go. So you're always welcome for new sport. Anyway, my question, Spencer. My great grandfather was in the BEF as part of the 2nd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment, and just during your presentation, I was getting out the movements of the 2nd Battalion here, and it strikes me my question is were they actually part of FitzClarence's command, or maybe wider command? Because just reading the diary here, they were extremely close, if not part of that action. And I was just wondering if you've got any insights or any views on that.
I have. So they weren't part of First Guards Brigade. First Guards Brigade, strangely enough, was all Scottish by the time FitzClarence took it over. The 2nd Royal Sussex were part of Bulfin Force, and Bulfin Force was 2nd Brigade plus some other assets. And so I haven't got the map up anymore, but if you imagine Guards Brigade in the north, 3rd Brigade in the centre, of course, 3rd Brigade gets overwhelmed. And then you've got Bulfin Force to the south, and that's where the Royal Sussex are. So they're heavily involved with what happens with Bulfin Force. And that in itself could be another talk, because Bulfin Force undertakes a remarkable counterattack of its own that's not as well known as the retaking of Gellivelt, but plays an incredible role in and of itself as well. And they're part of that counterattack as well. So they are heavily involved in this battle. But the nature of the German advance pushes them a little bit further to the south, away from Gellivelt. But then they take part in this incredible afternoon counterattack, masterminded by Bulfin. Perhaps that's a subject for another talk, because that's almost as incredible as the 2nd Worcester's counterattack as well.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
Super. Thanks for that, Paul. Spencer, I think we'll call that a day, if that's all right with you.
Thank you for your attention, everyone.
No worries, absolutely. So thanks very much, everybody, for coming along tonight. We're going again next week, so do keep registering for these webinars. And just finally, Spencer, sincere thanks for your sterling efforts once again. Much appreciated by everybody who's watching. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody. And that's all from us tonight. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières,